Hi, everybody. Let me get over to the material here. I wanted to take a second, catch up real quick. I've given you guys the Stop the Bleed course. You also have chapter 26 to read on bleeding. So that will accomplish chapter 26 for us. We're going to do chapter 25 right now, and I'm going to assign you guys the rest of the chapters that I have on my YouTube channel. And so I wanted to quickly go over trauma overview chapter with you. Of course, you were supposed to read this. You took the quizzes on 25, 26, and 27 last week. That's trauma overview, bleeding, and soft tissue injuries. And that was available on the YouTube channel. So I hope you've probably already watched the lecture on soft tissue injury. If you haven't, it's on there, so please do go watch it. But I wanted to make sure you had the trauma overview lecture, which is not currently up on the YouTube page, so I wanted to set that for you. The big takeaway in the trauma lecture is to remember that we have a scene time expectation of 10 minutes. You're supposed to be on scene with traumas that you can grab and go with for no more than 10 minutes. The concept behind that is what is going to save a trauma patient is a surgeon and an operating room and blood products. And so, since you don't have those things, getting the patient and getting off scene becomes paramount. Yes, you must manage ABCs and life threats. You must manage bleeding control. You must manage breathing, and you must manage covering any sucking chest wounds from head to toe, neck to navel, 360 degrees. That has to be done. But you should quickly package the patient as fast as you can after meeting all of those life threats. And you should transport the patient within 10 minutes. So there's an overriding 10-minute timeline going on with a trauma patient. Keep that in mind. Do you transport by ground or do you transport by air? That's another big consideration with trauma patients to take in to account. So if the patient is entrapped in a vehicle or in a building, then notifying a helicopter and using a helicopter is probably best practice, because by the time you get the patient untrapped and loaded, you could most likely fly the patient in better time than you can ground the patient. So you got to make those considerations. And there are policies and procedures that will exist in the agencies that you work in that will help you make that decision. So keep that in mind. Rapid transport's the big thing. We'll talk about trauma scoring. Glasgow Coma Scale is going to be a big deal in trauma patients. We want to know if the patient is conscious enough to manage their own airway. So we've learned a lot about GCS. Trauma is going to ask you for a GCS. So kind of familiarize yourself with that again. 15 being really great. 8 is the starting point when people aren't doing very well, and we probably need to start managing their airway, breathing for them. Maybe they even need a breathing device like a supraglottic airway or an intubation. So 15 is great. 8 or less is not great. And of course, 3 is unconscious, unresponsive. No eye, no verbal, no motor function that we can score. So familiarize yourself with that GCS again. As we look through this, we want to keep in mind that multi-system trauma is a killer. If you take any of the chapters of the trauma module and you make a problem for the patient in more than one of those chapters, that's multi-system trauma. An example is the patient has a gunshot wound to the core and they also have a femur fracture. Well, that would be multi-system. It only takes two systems to make it multi-system, and the patient has a higher mortality, higher chance of death, and so then your recognition of their trauma should be elevated. Your taking them to a trauma center should be the goal, and that 10-minute on-scene time frame becomes really important. Remember that there's something called, sorry, Scott's dying. Remember there's something called the golden hour with trauma patients. From the moment of their onset of trauma, they have about an hour to be on the operating room table if they statistically are going to have a good chance at survival. So keep that in mind. Multi-system trauma is a killer. So if you have a multi-system patient, you're not going to be splinting arms and splinting legs. If a patient's all broken and mangled and bangled, you're going to put them on a backboard, secure them to the backboard, manage their life threats, and emergently transport. Which brings me to the next statement. The long spine board is a full body splint. This week in lab and next week, we're going to learn splinting skills. But those splinting skills are supposed to be done on patients who have isolated injuries, meaning that that's the only injury. If someone's dislocated their left shoulder and that's all that's wrong with them, then you're well within your right to do a sling and swath, which we'll learn in lab, and that's what you're doing for them. If someone has a motor vehicle accident and isn't doing too hot, that person is a multi-system trauma patient, and you can't just go splinting their shoulder and isolating wounds. You got to treat them from head to toe. And so you would put that person on a long spine board, secure them with all the straps, and you would emergently transport, because the long spine board is a full body splint. So you don't have to individually splint the extremities of a multi-system trauma patient. You got to remember that. You would lose a lot of your 10-minute on-scene time if you were trying to splint individual arms and legs of a multi-system trauma patient. So when people are severely injured in trauma, we throw them on a backboard, secure them with all the straps appropriately and professionally, of course, and then emergently transport, because the long spine board is a full body splint. So keep that in mind. Okay, it goes on to say how dangerous trauma is. It's still the leading cause of death, and bleeding is still the leading cause of death in trauma patients. In considering trauma, we are always talking about energy, and we're always talking about mechanism of injury. How did the patient get injured? Did they fall from a great height? Did they get involved in a motor vehicle accident? Well, was it a head-on, or was it a rotational? Did the car spin around and around and around, hitting all kinds of things all the time? Did it roll over? Was there an ejection? Were there people in the same vehicle that were dead, but your patient's not? Because that would really concern me about your patient, even though they didn't die. The energy that took place in that car is pretty significant, so then I would trauma alert that patient. So know the difference between potential energy, kinetic energy, energy of work. Kinetic energy is going to be the big one you pay attention to. Energy is moving, and it doesn't stop moving until it's acted upon by something that stops it. So you're going to talk about, in this chapter, you're going to talk about primary collision and secondary collision, and even the third collision or the tertiary collision. They'll talk about as primary, secondary, and third collision. And so the first collision is when the car hit the tree. Bam. That's collision number one. And so your head flies forward and smacks the steering wheel. Okay? The secondary effects of that are that your organs fly forward inside of your body and they smack the internal cavities, causing additional injury. And it causes stretching and shearing of the vasculature. So you don't just have the internal energy concepts that are occurring, you also have this internal picture, this secondary injury pattern that's occurring inside when the organs are bouncing around their internal cavities. So you're going to see that talked about in the chapter. You need to pay attention to that. These are all the ones that are really big. As far as trauma mechanisms, these are the ones that need to go to trauma centers. So penetrating trauma, falling from greater than 20 feet or 3 times the height of the patient, motor vehicle collisions that are head-on, rotational, rollovers, ejections, stabbings. Those are high index of suspicion trauma mechanisms, and so they should go to a trauma center. Remember that blunt force trauma has injury you can't see. If someone gets smacked in the belly with a baseball bat, a lot of what is injured and hurt is underneath the skin. You can't see it. So your index of suspicion has got to be higher. Pay attention to the vehicle. Look at the windshield. Look at the steering wheel. Is the windshield busted? Is the steering wheel bent? Because if it is, then that means the body of the patient bent it. And so you got to pay attention to that. You're going to see questions again about the inside of the vehicle. If the windshield is busted, what part of the patient likely hit it? Well, their head. If the steering wheel is bent backwards, what part of the patient likely did that? Their chest did that. If the lower dashboard is bent up, what likely is injured on the patient? Well, I would expect their femurs and pelvis area and their extremities to be injured. So keep that in mind. You're going to see test questions directly about that. What you see in the picture here is called coup contra coup, and it goes to the third collision idea. Primary collision, vehicle strikes a tree. Secondary collision, person in the vehicle's head strikes the windshield. Third collision is the internal organ inside of that head bouncing against the skull bones. You got to keep that in mind. In this particular case, when the brain is bouncing back and forth in the skull, that's called coup contra coup, which is right down here. Okay? Coup contra coup. You need to remember that. Did airbags deploy? Were they wearing their seatbelts? That's all important. Look at this guy. He's got seatbelt signs. And so that means he's got bruising associated with the seatbelt, which tells me he's very injured. This guy likely has internal injuries. Here's the problem with seatbelt sign. It's a late sign. It takes time to develop this kind of bruising. So we don't often see this kind of bruising in the pre-hospital setting. It ended up occurring after the pre-hospital setting. Now, that's not always the case. Depends on the extent of the bruise, depends on the energy. But just remember that bruising grows in time. So you don't always get to see the bruising. It doesn't always get to tell on the patient's injury. As time goes on, the bruising increases, then the injury becomes more apparent. So your index of suspicion, your belief that the patient is likely injured, needs to be high because you may not see these signs that indicate the patient is actually injured. Keep that in mind. Rear end crashes versus front end crashes. Make sure you read the differences in those so that you can see what they're trying to indicate to be the injury patterns associated with them. Rollovers and rotationals are all up in the air. What could happen is all over the place. So you got to have a high index of suspicion with rollovers and rotationals. You're going to see test questions that say, an adult is struck by a vehicle while walking. Where would their injuries be? Well, I would expect them to be lower extremities and pelvis and abdomen because that's where the car would strike them. If it's a child, I would expect there to be head injuries because the child is much shorter, and so the head is going to bang down onto the car's hood. If they're wearing a helmet, you need to know if the helmet is damaged. Take a look at the helmet. Is the helmet damaged? I'll look at week 13. I don't know what I did to week 13. I'll have to look at it and see what happened to week 13. Ejections are always a high index of suspicion, so we should treat those very cautiously. Looking at the energy of this particular fall, you got to ask yourself with falls, did the patient fall because of a medical issue, or did the patient fall because they lost they got their foot caught on the curb, their foot caught on their shoe, the shoe got caught on the carpet? Those are mechanical falls. But what if the patient got dizzy and then fell? Well, now I have a medical and a trauma. What if the patient passed out and then they fail? Well, that's a medical and a trauma. You got to know whether it's mechanical, my shoe got caught on the carpet, or I got dizzy and then I fell. That's a big deal. Is the patient taking blood thinners? That's a big deal with falls. If you're on blood thinners, it increases your risk of injury. Did the patient lose consciousness when they fail? If they did, that increases all the potential for significant injury. Those are the questions I would ask. What did you land on? Feet, butt, hands, head? And what surface was it? Concrete, water, grass, mud? That all comes into factor on how damaging the injuries are going to be. Penetrating trauma, I remind you, neck to navel, 160 degrees, gets an occlusive bandage. If there is a penetrating trauma wound, a sucking chest wound, for example, here's a good image of that. Okay, this is a sucking chest wound, and so they've put on an occlusive bandage here. This wound is from neck to navel. It's 360 degrees from neck to navel, and so right here it's on the front right side of the patient, and they have put an occlusive wrap on top of it and taped it on 3 sides. Why? Because I don't want air getting into the chest cavity and collapsing the lungs. So you got to remember that occlusive bandages are applied to any wound that is neck to navel 360 degrees. Definitely in your trauma exam, you want to apply those. So if it's not a knife and it's a sucking wound, it's bubbling, and somebody got shot, then put an occlusive bandage on it. If it's an impaled penetrating object like the knife is in this scene, then you want to take a big bulky dressing and you want to stabilize this knife in place. We do not remove impaled objects unless you need to do CPR and it's in the way of CPR. You can only remove impaled objects if it impedes your ability to do CPR, but you should not remove impaled objects routinely. You should build up a bulky dressing to stabilize and protect the impaled object. That is what you do with impaled objects. Note that the energy of a penetrating wound like a bullet caused a lot more damage than you can see. Bullets don't just go in and out. They hit things while they're inside the patient's body. And every time a bullet hits something, it changes its trajectory. It changes its cavitational pattern. It changes the energy and the injury pattern that that bullet is capable of. So a person might get shot in the leg. The bullet might hit the femur and follow up into the chest and abdomen cavity. That happens to people. Bullets don't just keep traveling their path from the end of that gun that fired them. They encounter resistant objects in their pathway and they change their trajectory, they change their damage, they change their velocity, and so that causes damage you can't see. You need to remember that a person can get shot in an extremity and the bullet can travel into the core of that patient. You got to be careful with that. You got to pay attention to bullets. They do more damage than you think they have done. Blast injuries. This is a slide that's going to get test questions, so you got to pay attention to it. You have primary, that's the boom. What injuries occurred during the boom itself. Secondary is when stuff starts flying. Tertiary is when something that isn't flying is struck by. When something that isn't flying is struck by something that is flying. So a tertiary injury would be a person standing still and a 2x4 flies through the air and smacks him in the face. That's a tertiary injury. I don't know why this matters. It's absolutely stupid, but it does find its way to the quiz. So you got to answer those questions. And quaternary injuries would be the injuries that occurred superlateral. So burns, crush injuries, toxic inhalation, heart attacks from the blast, stuff like that would be quaternary. It gives you examples of each, so I would pay attention to that. People's middle ear can bust in the blast. Lungs can pop in the blast. Anything that's filled with air that is inflated when the boom went off could potentially rupture. Here's more examples of multi-system trauma. Here's the golden principles of trauma that I talked about. We get on scene, we control life threats, put chest seals on sucking wounds, stop the bleeding, support ABCs, treat for shock, immobilize the patient, and get off scene. You're expected to do what you see on this slide within 10 minutes and be off that scene, because what the patient needs is a trauma surgeon. 10 minutes or less. I'm going to let you read this. Remember to focus on DCAP BTLS as our acronym for trauma, deformities, contusions and crepitus, abrasions, punctures and penetrations, burns, tenderness, laceration, and swelling. That's what we're looking for when we assess the patient. Remember that the neck is included in the sucking chest wound world. Your trachea, if it gets a hole poked in it, it's going to start introducing air into the chest cavity, and that air can work against the breathing mechanisms. It can collapse the lungs. It can prevent your chest from rising. So you cannot allow air to be introduced into the patient's cavity, the neck to navel cavity. You must prevent that. So if there is a penetrating wound from neck to navel, it must get an occlusive bandage. The occlusive bandage we tend to choose is a chest seal. So the one that you will always see us using most commonly is something like the Hyphen. It's probably HYP, but whatever. Here it is, the Hyphen chest seal. So the Hyphen chest seal, the book will tell you that you're supposed to put on an occlusive gauze and that you tape the gauze on 3 sides, right? Well, the chest seals already come with the one valve system, meaning that air is allowed to leave the chest, but air is not allowed to come into the chest. If the patient goes to take a breath, the chest seal closes and doesn't allow air to introduce to the chest. When the patient exhales, if there's any air that can escape the chest, which would be a good thing, trapped air should escape the chest. It's allowed to do so because of the one-way valve system. It closes when they inhale and it opens when they exhale. So this is the most common dressing that you would put on a sucking chest wound, and it comes in a little package like this. Not the right one. There you go. So remember, neck to navel, 360 degrees. Injuries to the abdomen. If the organs of the abdomen are outside of the abdomen, that's normally worse visually than it is actually in an injury. So just remember to keep it warm, keep it moist, and keep it protected as far as sealing it. Saran wrap is a very good way to protect the abdominal quadrants. By the way, this is called an evisceration. An evisceration is when the abdominal quadrant's contents are allowed to escape. Say you get a laceration that's through your belly, your colon, your gut, will come right out because there's a lot of it. It looks worse than it typically is. You got to keep it warm, keep it moist, and keep it sealed, as in don't let air get into that space. The best way that we tend to be able to do that is by applying a big bulky dressing that's moist or saran wrap. Saran wrap's a good way to do that. There are pictures of evisceration treatment in the book, so give that a look. You're going to see test questions about evisceration treatment, which is keep it warm, keep it moist, keep it protected from introducing air into the belly. Trauma facilities, take a look at the level 1 versus 2, 3, and 4. Level 1 is the highest and the best. Level 2 is right next to it. So in our area, Trident is a level 2 and MUSC is a level 1. Those are our trauma centers. I'll let you read the medevac stuff. And here are your review questions. All right. So please go through the review questions. If you have any questions for me, let me know. You should have read this chapter already, but I wanted to definitely have lectured on it and given you the highlights so that you at least had a little bit of speech regarding the chapter from me. If you need anything else from me about this chapter, don't hesitate to reach out. I will continue to lecture with you guys later on tonight, and I'm posting this to my YouTube video, so let me know if you need something. Thanks.